Nora Bishop was 3 steps from the front door of the Cross estate when every floodlight on the property went dark at once. She stood frozen in the sudden black, her suitcase handle cutting into her palm, listening to dogs barking behind the hedges and men shouting orders somewhere near the gate. This was supposed to be her first day. Nobody had warned her the job came with this. A side door opened. A woman in a gray uniform grabbed her arm and pulled her inside without a single word, then locked 3 bolts behind them. "Stay low," the woman whispered, "and don't ask questions tonight. Tonight you just listen." Nora crouched beside her in a hallway that smelled of furniture polish and something sharper underneath it, something like fear. Through a cracked door she saw men crossing the lawn fast, flashlights cutting through the dark, voices low and clipped like soldiers on a mission. "Is this normal?" Nora whispered. The woman's face didn't change. "With Mr. Cross, more than you would think. My name is Margaret. I run this house. You must be the new girl from the agency." Nora nodded, even though nobody could see her nod in the dark. "I'm Nora Bishop." Margaret studied her for a long moment, the way a person studies someone they expect to lose within a week. "Most girls don't last past tonight," she said. "The ones who do, learn one rule fast. You see nothing, you hear nothing, you repeat nothing." Before Nora could answer, the lights snapped back on, harsh and sudden, and a man strode past the open doorway at the end of the hall. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat despite the warm night, and he moved like someone who had never once worried about where the exits were, because he was the reason other people worried about theirs. 2 men flanked him, murmuring updates she couldn't hear. He didn't look at Nora. He didn't look at anyone. He simply passed through the house like weather, and everyone in his path adjusted around him without being told to. "That's him," Margaret breathed. "That's Damon Cross. Try not to be noticed for the first month. It's safer that way." Nora watched him disappear up the staircase, and against every instinct telling her to be small and quiet, she felt something else entirely: curiosity, the kind that gets people fired, or worse. She didn't sleep that first night. She lay on a narrow bed in the staff quarters, staring at the ceiling, replaying the blackout, the shouting, the dogs, the man in the dark coat who carried himself like the only person in the house who had nothing left to be afraid of. In the morning, Margaret handed her a uniform 2 sizes too big, and a list of rules typed on a single sheet of paper. No eye contact in the East Wing, no questions about visitors, never enter the study after 9 at night, never touch the bottom drawer of the desk, locked or not. If a guest arrives that nobody introduces, you have not seen their face. Nora read the list twice and folded it into her pocket, already certain she would break at least one of these rules within the week. She started in the kitchen, polishing silver that didn't need polishing, while the rest of the staff moved around her like ghosts who had long ago stopped expecting kindness from this house. Nobody made small talk. Nobody met her eyes for longer than a second. A young man named Patrick, who tended the gardens, was the only one who smiled at her, and even that smile looked like something he kept tucked away for safekeeping, rather than something he gave freely. "It's not always like last night," he told her quietly, while trimming the hedges along the east wall. "Some weeks it's quiet as a church, other weeks it isn't." "What was last night?" Nora asked. Patrick's shears stopped moving. "Something with the Kane family," he said. "That's all I know, and honestly, that's all I want to know. Word of advice. Around here, the less you understand, the longer you keep your job." By her 3rd day, Nora had memorized the rhythm of the house. Breakfast was silent. Mid-morning brought a rotation of men in suits who came and went through the side entrance, never the front. Lunch was served at exactly noon, whether or not Damon Cross was present to eat it. And every evening, without fail, the study door closed at 9 and did not open again until morning. She broke the first rule by accident, on a Tuesday, when she misjudged the hallway and walked directly into the path of Damon Cross as he came down the east staircase. She froze, eyes lowered the way Margaret had taught her, waiting for him to pass without a word the way he passed everyone. Instead, he stopped. "You're new," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," she answered, eyes still on the floor. "Look at me when you speak," he said, not unkindly, just as a fact stated once and never repeated. She lifted her eyes, surprised by how plainly he was looking back at her, as if he had genuinely been waiting to see what she would do with the chance. "Nora Bishop," she said. He studied her the way a man studies a problem he hadn't expected to find in his own hallway. Most people in this house go out of their way not to be seen, Miss Bishop. I didn't know that was a skill I needed, she said, and immediately wondered if she had just ended her employment in a single sentence. Something shifted in his expression, something close to surprise, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He said nothing else. He simply continued down the stairs, and Nora stood there long after he'd gone, her pulse loud in her own ears, wondering whether she had just made a terrible mistake or the only honest choice she'd make all week. That evening, Margaret pulled her aside in the laundry room, her voice tight with something between worry and disbelief. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "Nothing," Nora said. "I just answered his question." Margaret shook her head slowly. "Nobody answers Mr. Cross like he's a person asking a question. They answer him like he's a storm they're trying not to provoke." She paused, studying Nora the way she had that first night in the dark. "You're either very brave or very foolish, girl. In this house, those two things tend to look the same until it's too late to tell them apart." Nora wanted to ask what that meant, but the warning in Margaret's eyes told her this conversation had already gone further than it should. Over the following days, small things began to change. Nora noticed that Damon Cross worked late into the night, the lamp in his study glowing long after the rest of the house had gone dark. She noticed that nobody brought him anything during those hours. Not coffee, not food, nothing. As if the staff had collectively agreed the study was a country with its own laws, and no one wanted to cross the border uninvited. So one night, against every rule on the typed page in her pocket, Nora made a pot of coffee, poured it into a plain white cup, and walked it to the study door at 10:30. She knocked once before she could talk herself out of it. There was a long pause before the door opened. Damon Cross stood there, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a pen still in his hand, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Surprise, maybe, or something older than surprise that he'd stopped expecting to feel. "You were told not to come up here after 9, he said. "I was," she agreed, holding out the cup. "You looked like you needed this more than you needed the rule followed." For a moment neither of them moved. Then he took the cup, his fingers briefly brushing hers, and something passed between them that had no name yet, something neither of them was foolish enough to acknowledge out loud. "Thank you, Miss Bishop," he said quietly, and closed the door. Nora walked back down the hallway with her heart hammering, equal parts certain she had just done something reckless, and certain she would do it again tomorrow if given half a reason. She didn't yet know that somewhere across the city, a man named Silas Kane was already speaking her name into a phone, asking his men to find out exactly who the new girl in the Cross household was, and why Damon Cross had suddenly started keeping his study light on later than ever before. She didn't know that the photograph turned face down on the study shelf, the one she'd glimpsed once while dusting, and never mentioned to anyone, held the answer to why this house was built on silence in the first place. All she knew, standing alone in that long, quiet hallway, was that for the first time since she'd arrived, she did not feel like a ghost drifting through someone else's fear. She felt seen, and in a house like this one, being seen was either the most dangerous thing that could happen to a person, or the only thing worth staying for. The coffee became a habit neither of them spoke about. Some nights Damon Cross said nothing at all, simply opened the door, took the cup, and gave her a nod that somehow carried more warmth than most people's entire conversations. Other nights he asked her small questions, where she'd grown up, why she'd taken a job in a house everyone in the city seemed to whisper about. She answered honestly, because she had quickly learned that lying to this man was both impossible and unnecessary. He never asked her anything he didn't already half know the answer to. What she didn't yet understand was how closely the rest of the world was now watching the new maid, who had walked, uninvited, into the one room in the house nobody else dared enter after dark. Margaret began watching her with a different kind of worry, the kind reserved not for someone who might lose her job, but for someone who might lose far more than that. Felix Grant, the head of security, started appearing in hallways Nora happened to be walking through, never saying much, but watching her the way a man watches a door he isn't sure should be left unlocked. And one evening, as Nora carried the coffee cup up the stairs as she now did every night, she found Felix waiting at the top, blocking her path with the quiet, immovable patience of a man used to being obeyed. "You should stop doing this," he said. "Doing what?" she asked, though she already knew. "Going up there every night." He glanced toward the study door, voice dropping lower. Mr. Cross hasn't let anyone close in 5 years. Not since his wife. Not since his son. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. People who get close to this family don't always get to stay close. Sometimes the world outside this house decides that, for them. Nora's stomach tightened, the warmth from a moment ago replaced by something colder. Is that a threat? She asked quietly. It's a warning, he said. There's a difference, and you'd do well to learn it fast. He stepped aside and let her pass, and Nora climbed the remaining stairs with the cup trembling slightly in her hand, Felix's words settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading out in directions she couldn't yet see. She knocked. The door opened. And for one more night the world outside the study stayed exactly where it belonged, on the other side of a door that wouldn't stay closed forever. 3 weeks into the job, Nora began noticing the same dark sedan parked across from the market where she bought fresh bread every Thursday morning. She told herself it meant nothing. Cities were full of dark sedans. But on the 4th Thursday, the man inside it lowered his window just enough to take her photograph, and she understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her bones, that someone outside the estate had started paying very close attention to her. She didn't tell Margaret. She didn't tell Felix. She told Damon Cross, because by then she had stopped pretending their late-night conversations were only about coffee. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening, the only sign that her words had landed somewhere deep. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her with an intensity she hadn't seen from him before, not even on that first night in the dark hallway. "Describe the car," he said. She did. Black, older model, a small dent above the rear wheel, a driver who never got out, only watched. Damon picked up his phone and made a call that lasted exactly 4 words. "Find the car, now." Then he hung up and looked at her again, his voice quieter this time. "You should have told someone the first Thursday." "I'm telling you now," she said. "That's not the same thing," he said, and for a moment she thought he might be angry. Instead, something in his face softened into an expression she hadn't earned the right to interpret yet. "You walked into my house 3 weeks ago and decided rules were optional. That works until the day it doesn't, Miss Bishop. I would prefer that day never comes." "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the window and stared out at the dark lawn for a long moment before speaking again. 5 years ago, someone watched this house the same way that Carr has been watching you. We didn't notice in time." He stopped there, the sentence cut clean, the way a man stops a story before it can hurt him twice. Nora waited, but he said nothing more. She had learned by now that this was how he gave away pieces of himself, in small fragments, never explained, never repeated. She didn't push. She simply set the coffee cup on his desk and let the silence between them do the rest of the talking. The next morning, Felix found her in the kitchen and informed her, without any of his usual warmth, that the dark sedan had been identified. It belonged to a man who worked for Silas Kane, the head of a rival family that had been at odds with the Cross organization for longer than Nora had been alive. The two families had history, Felix said, choosing his words with obvious care. The kind of history that didn't stay buried no matter how many years passed. "What kind of history?" Nora asked. Felix's face closed like a door. "The kind you don't ask about twice," he said, and walked away before she could press further. That evening, Margaret pulled her into the pantry, glancing over her shoulder twice before speaking. "Word's gotten around the house that the Kanes have noticed you," she said, voice low and urgent. "That's not a small thing, Nora. 5 years ago, Mr. Cross had a wife. Her name was Mary Ann, and a son, Oliver, who wasn't yet 4 years old. The Kanes wanted something from this family, and when Mr. Cross refused to give it to them, they took the only thing that would make him understand what refusal cost." Nora's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. "What happened to them?" she whispered, though some part of her already knew the shape of the answer even before Margaret said it. Margaret's eyes were wet, though her voice stayed steady, the voice of someone who had told this story to herself many times in order to survive telling it once out loud. "There was an accident. That's what the papers called it. Nobody in this house calls it that. Mr. Cross hasn't been the same man since, and he spent 5 years making sure nothing like it ever happens again. He keeps everyone at arm's length for a reason. He keeps that drawer locked for a reason." "What's in the drawer?" Nora asked. Margaret shook her head firmly. "That's not mine to tell, and it isn't yours to ask. Just understand what you're standing in the middle of, girl. This isn't a love story waiting to happen. It's a war that paused for 5 years, and you might be the thing that starts it again." The words sat heavy in Nora's chest for the rest of the night. She lay awake, turning them over, the photograph turned face down on the study shelf finally making sense, the silence of the house finally explained, the warning from Felix on the staircase finally given its true weight. She understood now why nobody met her eyes for longer than a second when she first arrived. They weren't being cold, they were grieving, every single one of them, in the particular silence of people who had watched something irreplaceable get taken, and had decided never to risk caring about anything in this house again. And yet, she thought about the way Damon Cross had looked at her the first time she'd looked back at him instead of lowering her eyes. She thought about the 4 words he'd spoken into the phone the moment she told him about the car, the speed of a man who had once been too slow and had spent 5 years making sure he never would be again. She understood, lying there in the dark, that staying close to this house meant staying close to danger that had already proven exactly how far it was willing to go. She got up anyway, the following night, and made the coffee. When she knocked, the door opened slower than usual, and Damon studied her for a long moment before stepping aside to let her in. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard," she confirmed. "And you're still here," he said, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "I'm still here," she said. He turned away from her then, walking to the window the way he always did when a conversation reached a place he didn't have language for. "Marianne used to bring me coffee like this," he said quietly, almost too quiet to catch. "Different cup, same hour. I haven't let anyone do it since." Nora stood very still, understanding now exactly what she had stumbled into without meaning to, and exactly how much it had cost him to let her stumble there. "I'm not trying to replace anything," she said softly. "I know," he said. "That's not why it frightens me." He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask him to. Some sentences, she was learning, were meant to be left exactly where they landed, unrepaired, the cracks in them more honest than any explanation could ever be. Over the following days, the household shifted in small ways Nora could feel but not quite name. Felix began briefing her, gently, on basic safety, which doors to avoid using alone, which routes into the city were watched and which weren't, how to recognize when she was being followed, and what to do if she ever was. Margaret started leaving an extra cup of tea outside Nora's door some mornings, a quiet apology perhaps for the pantry conversation that had clearly cost her something to have. Even Patrick, trimming his hedges along the east wall, began nodding to her with something closer to respect than the careful politeness he'd offered before. But the dark sedan didn't disappear. It simply changed locations, appearing now outside the bakery, now near the bus stop she used on her days off, always at a distance, always watching, never quite close enough to confront. Nora reported each sighting to Felix, who reported them up a chain she didn't fully understand, and each time, the response from the house tightened a little further. More guards at the gate, fewer visitors allowed through the side entrance, the floodlights now staying lit through the entire night, instead of switching off at midnight as they once had. One evening, a letter arrived at the estate, addressed to no one in particular, simply marked for the new girl. Felix intercepted it before it reached the kitchen, and when Nora finally saw it, hours later, in Damon's study, the single line inside chilled her more than anything Margaret had told her in the pantry. "We see what Mr. Cross has started keeping close again." There was no signature. There didn't need to be one. Damon read it twice before setting it down on the desk, his hand flat against the paper as though he could press the threat back into the ink it came from. "I should send you away," he said quietly, "somewhere far from this city, somewhere they'll never think to look." "Would that keep me safe?" Nora asked. "For a while," he admitted. "And would it keep you safe?" she asked. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at this house, she saw something in his expression that looked almost like fear, not for himself, but for the unbearable weight of choosing wrong twice in one lifetime. "I don't know how to do this again," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to watch someone walk into danger because of me, and just stand here and let it happen." "Then don't let it happen," Nora said, stepping closer despite every rule on the folded paper still tucked somewhere in the bottom of her drawer upstairs. "Don't send me away. Let me help you face whatever this is, instead of hiding from it." He studied her for a long, silent moment, the lamplight catching the exhaustion in his eyes, 5 years of careful distance cracking slightly under the weight of one letter and one woman who refused to be frightened off by it. "All right," he said finally. "But you do exactly as Felix tells you. No exceptions. No more late-night surprises that put you in danger I can't undo." "I make no promises," Nora said, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Damon Cross almost smiled. The letter was filed away, the threat noted, the household placed on a quiet, careful alert that nobody outside its walls would have noticed. But beneath the surface of ordinary days, beneath the polished silver, and the trimmed hedges, and the silent breakfasts, something had shifted permanently. The pause that had lasted 5 years had just been handed its reason to end, and this time, Nora Bishop stood directly in the middle of it, no longer a stranger the house had taken in, but a piece on a board that Silas Kane had only just begun to move against. Felix took her training seriously after that, more seriously than Nora expected from a man who had spent their first conversations treating her like an inconvenience he hadn't been consulted about. Every afternoon before her kitchen duties began, he walked her through the basics: how to notice a reflection that didn't belong in a shop window, how to cross a street twice instead of once if she felt eyes on her back, how to memorize an exit before she ever needed to use it. She absorbed it quickly, faster than he expected, and one rainy Tuesday, that training was tested in a way neither of them had planned for. She had gone into the city alone, against her better judgment, but with Felix's reluctant permission, to collect a parcel from the post office that Margaret hadn't trusted to any of the usual delivery routes. The walk back took her past the market square, and it was there, reflected faintly in the glass of a closed bakery window, that she noticed him, a man in a gray coat, half a block behind her, matching her pace exactly when she slowed, and slowing exactly when she sped up. Her pulse climbed, but she kept her face calm, the way Felix had drilled into her. She turned left at the corner, doubled back through a narrow alley lined with delivery crates, and crossed the street twice within the space of 2 minutes, watching from the corner of her eye as the man in gray hesitated, lost his rhythm, and finally split off toward a parked car at the curb. She didn't stop walking until she reached the estate gate, where Felix was waiting, arms crossed, his expression unreadable until she described what had happened: the alley, the crossing pattern, the moment the man gave up the chase. Something in his face shifted then, not quite a smile, but close enough to count as one from a man who rationed his approval carefully. "You did exactly what I taught you," he said. "I had a good teacher," she answered, breathless, the adrenaline only now beginning to fade from her chest. He studied her a moment longer, then said something that surprised her more than the chase itself had. "For what it's worth, Miss Bishop, I didn't think you'd last the week when you first walked through that gate. I'm glad I was wrong." That evening, when she told Damon what had happened, his reaction was less measured than Felix's had been. He stood from his desk so fast the chair scraped loudly against the floor, and for a moment she saw, beneath the calm authority he wore like a second coat, the same fear that had been in his eyes the night the letter arrived. "You were followed," he said, voice tight, "and you didn't call for a car." "I handled it," she said. "That isn't the point," he said, crossing the room toward her, close enough now that she could see the precise shade of worry behind his eyes, something darker than anger, something closer to grief revisiting old ground. "I can't lose someone else to this. Do you understand that? I cannot do that again." "You won't," she said, and meant it with a certainty she hadn't earned the right to promise but offered anyway, because in that moment it felt truer than any rule on the folded paper in her drawer. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand, the gesture so unfamiliar to him that his fingers trembled slightly against hers. "I don't know how to want something again," he admitted quietly, the words clearly costing him more than any speech he'd ever given to a room full of dangerous men. "I forgot how." "You're doing fine so far," Nora said softly. For the first time since she'd arrived, he laughed, a short, surprised sound, as though the laugh itself had caught him off guard. It was a small thing, barely more than a breath, but it filled the study with something the room hadn't held in 5 long years, and neither of them mentioned the locked drawer, or the photograph turned face down on the shelf, or the man in the gray coat who had given up his chase too easily for either of them to fully believe the danger was over. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning to gather itself, quietly, patiently, somewhere beyond the estate gates, waiting for the right night to arrive. That night came 2 weeks later, on an evening so ordinary that nobody in the house noticed the warning signs until it was already too late to stop what followed. The floodlights flickered once around 11, a small thing, the kind of glitch any old electrical system might produce, and Felix dismissed it after a quick check of the main panel. By midnight, the flicker had become a full blackout, and this time there was no mistaking it for a glitch. Nora was still awake, restless in the way she'd been every night since the man in the gray coat, when she heard the first shout from somewhere near the garden wall. She was at her window in seconds, watching dark shapes move along the tree line at the edge of the property, too coordinated to be anything but exactly what everyone in the house had been quietly dreading. She didn't wait for instructions. She grabbed the small flashlight Felix had given her during training and moved into the hallway, where the rest of the staff were already gathering in confused, frightened clusters. The calm rhythm of the house shattered into something close to chaos. Margaret was trying to herd the younger staff toward the safe room behind the pantry, her voice steady despite the fear plain on her face, and Nora fell into step beside her, helping move the youngest of the kitchen girls along the dark corridor. "Where's Patrick?" Nora asked, suddenly aware of the one face missing from the cluster moving toward safety. Margaret's expression answered before her words did. "He was in the garden shed when the lights went," she said. "He hasn't come in." Nora didn't think. She turned and ran the opposite direction, ignoring Margaret's sharp call of her name, out through the side door and into the dark garden where shouting voices and running footsteps now seemed to come from every direction at once. She found Patrick near the shed, slumped against the wall, his arm held awkwardly against his chest, his face pale in the dim light of her flashlight. "I'm fine," he said immediately, the way people always say it when they very clearly are not. "Caught my arm on the fence trying to get clear. Nothing serious." It looked serious enough to Nora, but there was no time to debate it. She helped him to his feet, looping his good arm over her shoulder, and together they made their slow way back toward the house, every shadow along the path suddenly suspicious, every distant shout a possible threat closing in. Halfway there, a beam of light swept across the lawn behind them, and Nora pulled Patrick down behind a low hedge without thinking, pressing a hand briefly over his mouth as two unfamiliar men jogged past on the gravel path not 10 feet from where they crouched. When the men had passed, she helped Patrick the rest of the way, finally reaching the side door where Felix was waiting, weapon drawn but lowered the instant he recognized them, his face flooding with relief he didn't bother hiding. "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said, even as he helped take Patrick's weight from her shoulder. "Someone had to," Nora said simply, and Felix, for once, didn't argue. Inside, the safe room behind the pantry was tense and crowded, the staff huddled together while the muffled sounds of the disturbance outside slowly quieted, the intruders apparently driven off or scattered by Felix's men before they reached the house itself. Nora knelt beside Patrick, using a clean dish towel to wrap the cut along his forearm where the fence had caught him, her hands steady even though her heart hadn't yet slowed from the run across the dark lawn. "You're better at this than you let on," Patrick said through gritted teeth as she tightened the wrap. "I used to help out at a clinic, back home," she admitted. "Never thought it would come in useful here." "Lucky for me it did," he said, managing a thin smile despite the pain. It was nearly an hour before Felix declared the grounds secure enough for the staff to leave the pantry, and by then word had already spread through the huddled group about what Nora had done, running out into the dark to bring Patrick back when every instinct should have told her to stay hidden. Margaret didn't say anything about it, but the look she gave Nora as they finally emerged into the kitchen carried more weight than words would have. Damon found her not long after, his usual composure visibly cracked, his coat torn at one sleeve from some encounter out near the gate that he didn't explain and she didn't ask about. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and stopped in front of her, his eyes moving over her as though checking for an injury his mind refused to believe wasn't there. "You went outside," he said, voice low and rough. "Patrick needed help," she said. "You could have been killed," he said, the words breaking slightly in the middle, the careful control he wore like armor finally slipping enough to show what was underneath it. "I wasn't," she said gently. "I'm here. I'm fine." He reached out and pulled her into him then, an embrace that had nothing practiced about it, nothing measured the way most of his gestures were. She felt him shaking slightly, just once, before he steadied himself, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper against her hair. "I told myself I wouldn't do this again," he said. "I told myself 5 years ago that I would never let myself need someone enough that losing them could break me a second time. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes raw in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "Tonight I stood at that gate, and the only thing I could think about was whether you were safe inside this house. Not the men outside it, not the years of work it took to build everything they're trying to take apart. You." Nora didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, simply reached up and rested her palm against his jaw, an answer that needed no words attached to it. Later that night, once the grounds had been swept twice over and the staff had finally settled into uneasy sleep, Damon led her to the study and, for the first time since she'd arrived at the estate, unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk himself, sliding it open with the careful reverence of a man handling something fragile enough to break with too much force. Inside lay a small collection of items, a child's wooden toy, slightly scorched along one edge, a woman's bracelet with a single charm shaped like a bird, and a folded newspaper clipping yellowed with age that Nora didn't ask to read. Damon held the toy gently in his palm, turning it over once before setting it back exactly where it had been. "This is what they took," he said quietly. "Not just them, this too. The part of me that used to believe I could keep people safe just by wanting to badly enough." Nora knelt beside the open drawer, not touching anything inside it, simply present beside him in the silence that followed. "You can't keep wanting badly enough be the only thing protecting people," she said softly. "But you can keep trying. That's not the same as failing, Damon. That's the only thing any of us can actually do." He closed the drawer slowly, the lock clicking back into place, though something about the way he did it felt different now, less like sealing away a wound, and more like setting something down that he no longer needed to carry quite so heavily alone. Outside the estate walls, in a part of the city Nora had never seen and hoped never to, Silas Kane received word that the attempt on the Cross property had failed, the staff unharmed, the gardener's injury minor, the new maid having proven, against every expectation, far more capable than anyone had accounted for. He listened to the report in silence, then set down his glass and said only one thing in response, a sentence that would have chilled Nora to the bone had she been there to hear it. "Then we stop watching her from a distance," he said, "and we make this personal." Morning arrived gray and quiet over the estate, the kind of stillness that follows a storm nobody had time to brace for. Felix walked the perimeter twice before breakfast, examining the cut fence near the garden shed, the disturbed gravel along the side path, the faint tire marks left in the soft earth beyond the wall where the intruder's vehicle had waited before fleeing. He found no answers there, only confirmation of what everyone already suspected, that the attempt had been a test, a way of measuring how quickly the house could respond, how far its defenses truly reached. Damon called a meeting in the study shortly after sunrise, gathering Felix and two of his most trusted men around the desk, while Nora stood near the window, included now in a conversation she would once have been firmly excluded from. The men debated options in low, clipped voices, increasing patrols, rerouting deliveries, perhaps relocating certain members of the household until the situation settled. Nora listened carefully, piecing together a picture of an organization far more careful and far more weary of conflict than the frightening reputation that preceded it through the city. "We could send a message back," one of the men suggested, his tone making clear exactly what kind of message he meant. Damon's response was immediate and final. "No," he said. "We respond, but we don't escalate first. I built this house on the promise that it would never cost another family what mine already paid. I'm not breaking that promise now, because Silas Kane wants to provoke me into it." The man didn't argue further, though his expression suggested he disagreed. Nora found herself unexpectedly proud of the answer, a small, quiet thing settling into place beside the fear still sitting heavy in her chest, the understanding that the man she'd come to care for was not simply the feared name whispered about across the city, but someone actively, deliberately choosing restraint in a world that rarely rewarded it. After the meeting dispersed, she found Patrick in the kitchen, his arm properly bandaged now by the doctor Felix had quietly brought in before dawn, sipping tea with the slightly dazed expression of a man still processing how close the previous night had come to costing him far more than a cut along his forearm. "How's the arm?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Sore," he admitted, "but attached, which I'm told counts as a win in this line of work." He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful behind his tired eyes. "You didn't have to come back for me last night." "Yes, I did," she said simply. He smiled, a real one this time, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him since her first week at the estate. "Margaret's right about you," he said. "You're either the bravest person this house has ever hired, or you've got no sense of self-preservation whatsoever. Honestly, at this point, I think it might be both." Nora laughed despite herself, the sound surprising in a morning that had otherwise carried nothing but tension since the moment the floodlights first flickered. It was a small thing, that laugh, shared between two people who had stood close to danger together and come out the other side of it. But it did more to settle the unease in her chest than any of the careful security briefings had managed. That afternoon, while the rest of the staff slowly returned to their usual routines, Nora found Damon alone in the garden, standing near the spot where Patrick had been found the night before, staring at the cut fence, as though it might explain itself to him if he looked long enough. "You haven't slept," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Neither have you," he countered. She didn't deny it. They stood together in silence for a while, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the lawn, before he finally spoke again, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Marianne used to garden here," he said. "Roses mostly. She wasn't very good at it. Killed more of them than she ever managed to grow, but she loved doing it anyway." He gestured toward a patch of overgrown soil near the wall, long since reclaimed by weeds. "I had it cleared after she died. Couldn't stand looking at something she'd touched and failed to keep alive. Felt too much like a lesson I didn't want to learn twice." Nora studied the patch of bare earth, understanding now why it stood empty while the rest of the garden flourished under Patrick's careful attention. "Maybe it's time to plant something there again," she said gently, "not to replace what was lost, just to prove the ground's still good for something." Damon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the empty soil. "Maybe," he said finally, and though it was only one word, it carried more hope in it than anything else he'd said to her since the night she first knocked on his study door. That evening, as the household finally began to settle into something resembling its usual rhythm, Felix intercepted a phone call routed through the estate's private line, a call that traced back, after some difficulty, to a number associated with the Kane organization. He brought the message straight to Damon's study, his face grim in a way that told Nora, even before he spoke, that whatever had been said was far worse than another vague warning scrawled on unsigned paper. "They know about the Maid," Felix said without preamble. "Not just that she's here. They know her schedule, her market day, the clinic where she used to volunteer back home. Someone's been digging deep, and they've stopped pretending otherwise." Damon's hands tightened against the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale. "What exactly did they say?" he asked, voice dangerously controlled. Felix hesitated, glancing once at Nora before answering. "They said the next conversation wouldn't be over the phone," he said. "They said it would be in person, with her." The room went very still, the kind of stillness that settles over a house the moment before everything in it changes irreversibly. Nora felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she didn't move, didn't let the fear show on her face the way Felix's training had taught her, even as her mind raced ahead to understand exactly what kind of conversation a man like Silas Kane intended to have, and exactly how far he was prepared to go to make sure it happened on his terms, instead of anyone else's. For 3 days, the household operated under a kind of careful siege, Nora confined to the estate grounds, every door doubled in its watch, every delivery searched twice before it crossed the gate. She told herself she felt safe inside those walls, and for those 3 days, she nearly believed it. On the second of those 3 days, Felix came to Damon with news that unsettled the household more than the threatening phone call itself had. The information Kane's people had gathered, the schedules, the market days, details that should never have left the estate, hadn't come from outside surveillance alone. Someone inside the house had been talking. Damon's expression went very still when Felix laid it out, the careful evidence pointing toward one of the younger kitchen staff, a girl named Polly who had joined the household only a few months before Nora, quiet and unassuming, the kind of person nobody thought twice about overlooking. Felix had traced a pattern of small, seemingly innocent phone calls back to a number connected, however loosely, to Kane's outer circle. "Bring her in," Damon said, his voice carrying none of the anger Nora half expected, only a weary kind of resignation. Polly arrived in the study trembling, her eyes red-rimmed before anyone had said a single word to her, and within minutes, the full, painful truth came spilling out between broken sobs. Her younger brother had fallen badly into debt with men connected to Kane's organization months earlier, and when those men discovered where his sister worked, the terms of his survival had shifted, Small details about the household in exchange for his safety. Nothing that felt dangerous at first, just a schedule here, a delivery time there, until the requests grew larger, and she no longer felt she had any way to refuse them. "I didn't know they'd use it to hurt anyone," Polly said, her voice breaking entirely. "I swear I didn't know it would go this far. I just wanted my brother to come home safe." The room was silent for a long moment, Felix's jaw tight with the particular frustration of a man who took security breaches personally. Damon studying the frightened girl in front of him with an expression Nora couldn't quite read. She expected anger. She expected, given everything Margaret had told her about the kind of world this house operated within, something far harsher than anger. Instead, Damon knelt slightly, bringing himself level with the trembling girl, rather than looming over her the way his position in the room might have allowed. "Where is your brother now?" he asked quietly. "A small apartment near the docks," Polly managed. "I haven't been able to reach him in 2 days. I think that's why they're escalating. I think they're running out of patience with both of us." Damon stood and looked at Felix, something decided already settling into his expression. "Find him," he said simply. "Tonight, if it's possible. Whatever debt he owes, we'll handle it through people who don't deal in threats against frightened sisters." He turned back to Polly, his voice gentling slightly. "You made a mistake. A serious one. But you made it trying to protect someone you love, and I understand that better than most people in this city ever could. You're not losing your position here, but you are going to help Felix understand exactly what you told them and when, every detail, so we can move ahead of whatever they're planning next, instead of constantly reacting to it." Polly nodded quickly, relief and shame warring openly across her young face, and within the hour, Felix's men were already moving to locate her brother. A small mercy extended in the middle of a much larger danger that none of them yet fully understood was about to come to a head. Nora, who had stood quietly near the window through the entire exchange, found herself studying Damon with something close to wonder once the room had cleared. "I expected you to be harder on her," she admitted once they were alone. He looked tired suddenly, the weight of the day settling visibly across his shoulders. "Cruelty doesn't make a house safer," he said. "It just teaches everyone in it to hide their fear, instead of bringing it to someone who can actually help. I spent the early years of this work believing the opposite. It cost me more than I ever want to explain in detail." He shook his head slowly. Polly was scared and cornered and made a choice most people would understand even if they wouldn't make it themselves. "Cain is the one who built the trap. I'm not interested in punishing the person who got caught in it instead of the person who set it." Nora crossed the room and took his hand, neither of them needing to say anything further about it. But the breach, however gently handled, left an unmistakable mark on the household's sense of safety. The understanding that danger hadn't simply been watching from outside the gates, but had found its way, however unintentionally, into the very rhythm of their daily lives. Felix doubled the household's internal precautions after that. Careful conversations about what details stayed within the walls and what never left them, and though nobody blamed Polly openly, a new, careful wariness settled over the staff that hadn't fully existed before, even in the days following the break-in itself. It was against this backdrop, 3 days later, that Nora made her way to the small chapel at the edge of the property, carrying tea for Margaret's quiet morning ritual, unaware that the information Cain needed to set his next move into motion had already been gathered, weeks earlier, long before Polly's confession had ever interrupted the flow of details reaching his people, a final piece of surveillance already filed away, and waiting for exactly the right, careless morning to be used. It happened on the 4th day, in the one place nobody had thought to guard closely enough, the small chapel at the edge of the property where Margaret liked to sit quietly each morning before the rest of the house woke. Nora had gone to bring her tea, the same small kindness Margaret had once shown her, and found the chapel empty, the door standing open in a way it never usually did. She should have called for Felix immediately. She would think about that mistake for a long time afterward, the half-second of hesitation where curiosity outpaced caution, where she stepped inside to check instead of stepping back to raise the alarm. The hand that closed over her mouth came from behind, swift and certain, and the last thing she registered before the world tilted into darkness was the faint, sharp smell of something chemical, pressed briefly against the cloth at her face. She woke slowly, her head heavy, her wrists bound loosely enough that she understood immediately this wasn't meant to be a place she escaped from easily, but a place she was meant to sit and wait in, frightened, until someone decided what came next. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single bulb overhead, the air carrying the faint, stale smell of a building that hadn't been properly used in years. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale the way Felix had taught her, refusing to let the panic climbing her chest take hold of her thinking. Panic made people careless, he'd told her once, during one of their training sessions. Calm people find the way out. Panicked people just wait to be found. Footsteps approached eventually, unhurried, and the door opened to reveal a man she recognized immediately from the photographs Felix had once shown her during a briefing she'd hoped, foolishly, she'd never need to remember. Silas Kane studied her with the detached curiosity of a man examining a piece on a chessboard rather than a person sitting frightened in front of him. "You're not what I expected," he said, settling into a chair across from her with unhurried calm. "Damon Cross doesn't usually let people close enough to matter, yet here you are." "I clean his floors," Nora said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm not sure why that warrants this much attention." Kane smiled thinly. "You're either very good at pretending to be unimportant, or you genuinely don't understand what you've become to him." He leaned forward slightly. "Either way, you're useful to me now. A message that gets delivered far more effectively than any letter ever could." He left her alone after that, the door locking with a heavy, final sound, and Nora spent the next hour studying every inch of the small room with the same careful attention she'd once given to memorizing exits along the city streets. There was no window, but there was a vent near the ceiling, slightly loose at one corner. There was a chair, sturdy enough to stand on, and there were voices, faint but audible, drifting occasionally from somewhere beyond the door. The casual conversation of men who had clearly grown comfortable in this place over a long stretch of time, careless in the way only people who believe themselves entirely safe can afford to be. She listened for nearly 2 hours, piecing together fragments, a mention of a delivery truck scheduled for the following morning, a complaint about a guard rotation running short 2 men this week, an offhand remark about the side entrance near the old loading dock being faster than walking the full length of the building. None of it had been meant for her ears, but all of it, she realized, slowly assembling into something useful, was exactly the kind of information someone underestimated, as just the help might be allowed to overhear without anyone thinking twice about it. When the door finally opened again, hours later, it wasn't Kane who entered but a younger guard, clearly less experienced, carrying a tray of food he set down without quite meeting her eyes. Nora recognized the opportunity the moment she saw it, the slight nervousness in his posture, the way his attention kept drifting toward the door, as though worried about being caught lingering. "You don't seem like you enjoy this kind of work," she said quietly, watching him carefully. He didn't answer, but his jaw tightened in a way that told her she'd guessed correctly. "I'm not asking you to help me," she continued, keeping her voice calm and unhurried, the way Felix had taught her to speak when trying to disarm rather than provoke. "I'm just saying, when this is over, and it will be over, people remember who made things harder and who didn't. That's all." The guard said nothing, gathering the tray's empty dishes and leaving without a word, but Nora noted the way his eyes lingered on the loose vent cover near the ceiling, before he closed the door behind him, an almost imperceptible flicker of attention that told her, with quiet certainty, that her words had landed somewhere. She didn't wait for him to act on it. The moment the footsteps faded, she dragged the chair beneath the vent and worked the loose corner free with steady, patient fingers, ignoring the ache building in her shoulders, the dust that fell into her eyes, the faint tremor of fear she refused to let slow her down. The vent gave way after several long minutes, revealing a narrow crawl space that smelled of old metal and dust, barely wide enough for her to fit through, but wide enough. Meanwhile, across the city, Damon Cross had broken every rule he'd built his careful, controlled life around. He'd gone to the meeting point Kane's men had specified himself, alone, against Felix's furious objections, refusing every offer of backup that might have given Kane an excuse to call the entire exchange off before it began. "You're walking into exactly what he wants," Felix had argued, blocking the study door with his whole body, something he had never once dared to do before. "Then I'll walk in anyway," Damon had answered, voice flat with a kind of resolve Felix had only seen from him once before, 5 years ago, in the terrible days following Marianne and Oliver, when grief had briefly made him reckless before settling into the long, careful caution that had defined him ever since. "I'm not losing her the way I lost them. Not because I hesitated. Not because I waited for the safe option that doesn't exist anymore." He arrived at the address alone, exactly as instructed, walking into a building that smelled of dust and old machinery, every instinct in him screaming to move faster, to search every room at once, to undo 5 years of careful restraint in a single reckless night, if that was what it took to bring her home. He didn't have to search long. Nora met him halfway down the main corridor, having already climbed free of the crawl space, slipped past the distracted guard rotation, and made her way through the old loading dock, exactly as the careless conversation she'd overheard had promised she could. She was dusty, her wrists still marked from the loosened bindings, but steady on her feet, very much the woman who had walked uninvited into his study months before and decided rules were simply suggestions waiting to be tested. Damon stopped dead in the corridor, staring at her as though his mind refused to immediately trust what his eyes were showing him. "You're out," he said, voice hoarse with disbelief. "I got myself out," she corrected gently, managing a small, exhausted smile despite everything. "Took me long enough, but yes, I'm out." He crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 quick strides and pulled her into him, holding on with a kind of desperate relief that needed no further words attached to it. Behind them, the sound of raised voices signaled that her absence had finally been discovered, but neither of them moved right away, both of them simply standing there in the dim hallway, breathing in the simple, overwhelming fact that she was alive, and free, and standing on her own 2 feet, without anyone having needed to save her at all. "We need to move," Damon finally said, pulling back just enough to study her face. "Now, before they realize you're gone." "I'm ready," Nora said, and together they made their way out through the loading dock, into the cold night air, leaving behind a building full of men who would soon discover that the woman they'd taken as leverage had simply walked herself free, calmly, without panic, doing what none of Silas Kane's hardened guards had thought a frightened maid capable of attempting. By the time Felix's men arrived to secure the perimeter, Damon and Nora were already 3 streets away, safe inside a car speeding back toward the estate, and somewhere behind them, Silas Kane stood in an empty room staring at a discarded loosened vent cover, understanding, with the first real flicker of unease he'd felt in years, that he had badly, fundamentally underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. The drive back was quiet at first, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed but before anyone trusts the calm enough to speak into it. Nora watched the city lights blur past the window, her hands finally beginning to shake now that there was nothing left requiring her to stay perfectly steady. Damon noticed, reaching over without a word to take one of her trembling hands in his, holding it firmly against his knee, as though the contact alone might keep the shaking from spreading any further. "How did you get out?" he finally asked, his voice rough with a mixture of awe and lingering fear. "I listened," she said simply. "They talked like I wasn't even in the room. Guard rotations, delivery schedules, which door was faster than which hallway. Nobody thinks the maid is paying attention." She paused, a faint, exhausted smile crossing her face. "Turns out that's a mistake people keep making around me." Damon studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, equal parts pride and something heavier, something that looked almost like guilt. "I should never have let this happen," he said quietly. "I told myself bringing you close to this house was different from before, that I'd learned enough to protect what I cared about this time." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. I nearly proved that the worst possible way." "You didn't let anything happen," Nora said firmly, turning to face him properly despite the awkward angle of the car seat. "Silas Kane did this, not you. And I got myself out, which means whatever lesson you think you need to learn from tonight, the lesson isn't that I'm fragile, it's that I'm not." He didn't answer right away, but something in his posture eased slightly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough to notice. When they finally arrived at the estate, the gate swung open before the car had even fully stopped, the entire household apparently having gathered near the entrance the moment word reached them that Nora had been found. Margaret reached the car first, pulling Nora into an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked the breath from her, tears she didn't bother hiding running freely down her face. "I told you," the older woman said, voice thick with emotion. "I told you. This house doesn't let go of people easily once it's decided to care about them." "Looks like the house was right about you twice over now." Felix arrived a moment later, his usual composed authority cracked wide open by visible relief, though he said little beyond a firm nod and a quiet, "You did well, Miss Bishop." That carried more weight coming from him than an entire speech might have from anyone else. Patrick, his arm still bandaged from the break-in, simply squeezed her shoulder once, wordlessly, the gesture saying everything his careful, dry humor usually preferred to leave unspoken. Inside, once the household had finally settled enough to breathe properly again, Damon called Felix and his closest men into the study, and this time, he didn't ask Nora to wait outside while the decisions were made. "This ends now," Damon said, his voice carrying a finality none of them had heard from him in the 5 long years since Marianne and Oliver. Not with retaliation, not with more violence answering violence the way it always has between our families. He looked around the room at each of them in turn. "We have enough now, the recordings from tonight, the guard who helped her, witnesses who'll talk once they understand Kane's organization is the one about to come apart from the inside. We take it to people who can end this through the law, instead of through more bloodshed neither of our families can afford to keep surviving." Felix exchanged a glance with the other men, clearly surprised by the direction, but after a long moment he nodded slowly. "It's not the path I'd have chosen 5 years ago," he admitted, "but it might be the only one that actually stops this, instead of just pausing it again." Damon's gaze found Nora across the room, and something passed between them that needed no further explanation. "You did this," he said quietly. "You walked out of that building on your own, and in doing it, you handed me a way to end this without becoming the very thing I've spent 5 years trying not to become. I just wanted to come home," Nora said softly. "Whatever ending gets us there safely, that's the one I'll take." The plan moved quickly after that, Felix and his men working through the night compiling evidence, reaching out through careful, trusted channels to contacts who had long wanted a reason to move against Silas Kane's operation without the city descending into open conflict to do it. Word would take days to fully unfold, but the first cracks were already visible by morning, quiet shifts in the balance of power that Kane himself would only fully understand once it was far too late to stop them. For now, though, in the gray hush of early morning, Nora sat curled in a chair near the study window, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion she'd held at bay through every careful, calculated minute of the night before. Damon sat across from her, neither of them speaking, simply existing together in the quiet aftermath of a danger that had, against every fear either of them carried, ended without taking anything further from either of their already fractured, careful hearts. "You should sleep," he said eventually, his voice gentle in a way that still occasionally caught her off guard, given everything she now knew about the careful, controlled man he presented to the rest of the world. "So should you," she answered. Neither of them moved. Outside the window, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to soften the dark lawn, the same lawn where dogs had barked and floodlights had failed on her very first night in this house, the same lawn where, months later, an empty patch of soil still waited for someone brave enough to decide it was finally time to plant something new in it. The weeks that followed moved differently than any Nora had known since arriving at the estate, slower in some ways, faster in others. The careful quiet of the household replaced by something that finally resembled ordinary life, rather than a long-held breath waiting for the next disaster to arrive. The evidence Felix and his men had gathered made its way, piece by careful piece, into the hands of people with the authority and the will to act on it, and within a month, word reached the estate that Silas Kane's operation had begun collapsing from within, his own people turning against him, once they understood how exposed his reckless decisions had left them all. Damon received the news quietly, standing at the same study window where he'd once told Nora about Marianne's roses, his expression unreadable for a long moment before something in his shoulders finally, visibly eased. "It's over," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of 5 long years finally allowed to set themselves down. "It's over," Nora agreed, coming to stand beside him. He turned to look at her then, and for the first time since she'd known him, the careful distance he kept behind his eyes was entirely absent, replaced by something open and unguarded that made her breath catch in her chest. "I keep trying to find the right way to say this," he admitted. "I've negotiated with dangerous men my whole adult life, and somehow this is the conversation I don't know how to start." "You're doing fine so far," Nora said softly, echoing the words she'd once offered him on the night everything between them had first begun to shift. He smiled at the echo, recognizing it, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, worn photograph, the same one she remembered from her first weeks in the house, the one that had sat turned face down on the study shelf for so long, nobody dared mention it aloud. He held it out to her now, finally turned face up, a young woman with a warm, easy smile holding a small boy on her hip, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame of the picture. "This is Marianne," he said, "and Oliver. I kept this turned away for 5 years because looking at it felt like opening a wound I didn't know how to close." He paused, his thumb brushing gently over the edge of the photograph. "I'm not turning it away anymore, not because I've stopped loving them or stopped missing what we had, but because I think they'd want this house to hold more than grief in it. I think they'd want it to hold this too." Nora studied the photograph carefully, understanding the weight of what he was offering her, not just a glimpse into his past, but permission to exist alongside it rather than in place of it. "They look happy," she said gently. "They were," he said, "and I'd like to be again, with you, if you'll let me." She looked up at him, the question settling into the space between them, with the same quiet gravity as every important moment they'd shared since that first night in the dark hallway. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I told you that already. I meant it then. I mean it more now." He set the photograph carefully on the desk, no longer hidden, no longer turned away, and reached for her hand instead, holding it the way a man holds something he has finally, fully decided he is allowed to keep. That afternoon, for the first time in 5 years, Damon Cross walked out into the garden carrying a small bundle of rose cuttings Patrick had quietly sourced for him weeks earlier, sensing, perhaps before either of the two people at the center of the household's quiet transformation fully realized it themselves, that this particular patch of empty soil was finally ready to be filled again. Nora knelt beside him as he worked the soil loose with his bare hands, an awkward, unpracticed gesture from a man more accustomed to boardrooms and careful negotiations than gardening, and together they planted the first cutting in silence, the kind of silence that no longer needed filling with explanations or careful warnings about rules best left unbroken. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, a soft, knowing smile on her face, as she finally allowed herself to believe that the house she had served faithfully through its darkest years might, after everything, find its way back toward something resembling peace. Felix, standing nearby with the easy posture of a man no longer braced for the next threat to walk through the gate, exchanged a quiet glance with her, both of them understanding without needing to say it aloud that the new girl from the agency had done something none of Silas Kane's men, none of the careful security measures, none of the 5 long years of grief and caution had managed to do on their own. She had brought the house back to life simply by refusing to be afraid of it. Patrick, tending the hedges along the east wall as he had on Nora's very first day, called over with a grin as he caught sight of the 2 figures kneeling in the garden soil. "About time someone finally did something useful with that patch of dirt," he said. "I was starting to think it'd stay empty until the end of time." Damon glanced back at him, something easy and unguarded in his expression that the household hadn't seen from him in longer than most of them could remember. "Some things just take the right person showing up to fix them," he said, and beside him, Nora laughed, the sound carrying easily across the quiet garden, settling into the walls of a house that had finally, after everything it had survived, learned how to hold both grief and joy without breaking under the weight of either. In the months that followed, the estate slowly became known for something other than the fear it once carried through the city's quiet conversations. The staff no longer moved like ghosts through its hallways, no longer flinched at sudden sounds, or kept their eyes carefully lowered out of habit rather than respect. Margaret began allowing herself small kindnesses she'd long denied the household, a radio playing softly in the kitchen during slow afternoons, fresh flowers on the dining table that had nothing to do with appearances, and everything to do with simply liking the way they looked. Felix, still careful, still thorough in his duties, nonetheless began smiling more easily, the constant tension that had once defined his posture, slowly easing into something closer to quiet contentment. And in the garden, where roses Marianne would have been proud of slowly began climbing the east wall under Patrick's careful tending, Nora Bishop, who had once arrived at this house as a stranger nobody expected to last the week, found herself exactly where she'd never imagined she would be, standing beside a man the entire city had once feared, watching him laugh freely for the first time in 5 long years, understanding finally that the bravest thing she had ever done wasn't walking into danger or escaping it through her own quiet cleverness, but simply choosing, again and again, to see the person behind the fear everyone else had been too afraid to look past. Damon Cross had spent 5 years building walls so careful and so complete that even he had begun to believe nothing could ever find its way past them again. It had taken one new maid, unafraid of rules typed on a single folded sheet of paper, to prove him wrong, and in proving him wrong, to give him back something he'd long since stopped believing he deserved to have. A house that finally, fully, felt like a home again, rather than a fortress built around an absence it could never quite stop grieving. A year passed before the city fully understood how much had changed inside the gates of the Cross estate. The trial against what remained of Silas Kane's organization concluded quietly, away from headlines. The careful evidence Felix had gathered enough to dismantle a network built on fear, without ever requiring the kind of public spectacle that might have endangered the household further. Kane himself disappeared from the city's conversations entirely, his name fading the way names do once the power behind them has been stripped away, mentioned now only in passing, a cautionary tale rather than a continuing threat. Nora wrote to her mother that spring, a long letter explaining, as carefully as she could without revealing more than was safe to put on paper, why she had decided to stay on at the estate, long past the temporary placement the agency had originally arranged. She didn't expect her mother to fully understand it, the strange path that had carried her from a modest apartment 2 towns over, into the middle of a household the whole city once spoke of only in lowered voices. But she tried anyway, describing the garden Patrick had helped her plant, the quiet mornings with Margaret in the kitchen, the particular, hard-won peace that had settled over a house that used to flinch at sudden footsteps. "You found yourself a strange sort of family," her mother wrote back weeks later, in handwriting Nora had known her whole life. "I always told you that you had more courage than sense, sweetheart. Looks like it finally found somewhere good to be useful." Felix, for his part, never spoke much about what the past year had cost him personally, the sleepless nights, the careful, exhausting vigilance required to keep a household safe through a war neither he nor anyone else in it had asked to fight. But Nora noticed, slowly, the small changes in him, the way he began arriving at breakfast a few minutes earlier than strictly necessary, simply to sit with the rest of the staff, rather than patrol the grounds alone, the way his clipped, efficient warnings softened, over time, into something closer to genuine conversation. One afternoon, watching him laugh at something Patrick said while the two of them repaired a section of fence near the garden wall, Nora realized she was looking at a man finally allowing himself to exist as something other than a guard standing permanently at the edge of disaster. Margaret, too, changed in ways the household noticed without ever quite discussing aloud. She began taking Sunday afternoons off entirely, something she hadn't done in all the years she'd run the house, spending them with a sister who lived across the city, returning each week with small stories about nieces and nephews she'd previously kept carefully separate from the careful, guarded world of the estate. When Nora asked her about it one evening, Margaret simply shrugged, folding a stack of linens with practiced hands. "I spent 5 years keeping this house running, like it might fall apart the second I looked away," she said. "Turns out it holds together just fine without me hovering over every corner of it. Took your arrival to teach me that, strange as it sounds." "It doesn't sound strange," Nora said. "It sounds like exactly what this house needed." The garden by the following summer had become something of a quiet pride for the entire household, the roses along the east wall now climbing in full, deliberate bloom, deep red blossoms that Patrick tended, with the same careful attention he'd once reserved only for the hedges nobody particularly noticed. Damon took to spending early mornings there before the rest of the house woke, a habit Nora discovered one dawn when she found him kneeling in the soil, sleeves rolled up, carefully clearing space for a new row of cuttings. "You're out here early," she said, settling onto the low stone bench nearby. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, not looking up from his work. "Good kind of can't sleep, though. Different from how it used to be." She watched him work in comfortable silence for a while, the early light catching the gray that had begun threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that no longer carried quite so much weight as they once had. It occurred to her, watching him, that the man she had first seen striding silently through a darkened hallway, untouchable, unreachable, surrounded by men who flinched at his slightest gesture, bore almost no resemblance to the man kneeling in front of her now, dirt under his fingernails, utterly at ease in a way she doubted most of the city would ever believe possible. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, finally glancing up at her. "That you've changed," she said honestly, "more than I think you realize." He considered that for a moment, sitting back on his heels. "I think I just finally let myself stop pretending I hadn't," he said. "Pretending costs more than people realize. Took me 5 years and one extremely stubborn maid to figure that out. I prefer determined," she said, smiling. He laughed, the sound easy now, unguarded, Nothing like the rare, surprised laugh she'd first earned from him in the study all those months ago. "We can call it whatever you like," he said, "as long as you don't stop being whatever it is. This house runs better with you stubbornly determined in it." Later that summer, the estate hosted its first gathering in over 5 years. A modest evening meant to thank the small circle of people who had helped see the household through its hardest months. Felix and his team, the doctor who had quietly tended Patrick's arm the night of the break-in, even the young guard from Kane's organization who had, in his own small, frightened way, helped Nora find her way free, and who Felix had since quietly arranged a fresh start for, far from the wreckage of the operation he'd once been trapped within. The evening was simple, lanterns strung along the garden paths, food prepared by Margaret with obvious care, laughter drifting easily across a lawn that had once known only silence and watchful fear. Standing near the roses as the evening wound down, Damon took Nora's hand and led her a short distance from the gathered voices, toward the quiet edge of the garden, where the first cutting they'd planted together now stood taller than either of them had expected, its blooms catching the last of the evening light. "I never thought I'd want any of this again," he said quietly, gesturing not just to the garden, but to the lanterns, the laughter, the whole transformed shape of the life unfolding behind them. "A year ago, I would have told you a house like mine wasn't built for it. Too much history, too much danger that never fully goes away. And now?" Nora asked. "Now I think maybe the danger was never the reason this house felt so empty," he said. "I think it was just easier to blame the danger than admit how much I'd let myself disappear into protecting against it." He turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way that still, even now, occasionally caught her by surprise. "You didn't just survive what this house put you through, Nora. You taught it how to be lived in again. That's not something I know how to repay." "You don't have to repay it," she said softly. "Just keep choosing it. That's enough." He smiled, the kind of smile that no longer carried any trace of the careful, guarded man who had once passed silently through his own hallways like weather nobody dared comment on. "I intend to," he said, "for as long as you'll let me." The locked drawer remained in his desk, though it no longer needed its lock quite so badly as it once had. The small collection of memories inside it, no longer a wound kept carefully hidden, but simply a part of the story this house now carried forward, alongside the new memories slowly being built in the same rooms that had once known only silence and careful, watchful fear. And on quiet evenings, when the lamp in the study still glowed long after the rest of the house had gone dark, it was no longer a sign of a man working alone through grief he didn't know how to name. It was simply Damon Cross and Nora Bishop, sharing a pot of coffee neither of them needed an excuse to make anymore, talking softly about nothing important at all, exactly the way two people are supposed to spend their evenings once the danger has finally, truly passed, and all that remains is the quiet, ordinary, hard-won business of choosing each other, one evening at a time, for as long as either of them is given to choose.